Hi, I'm Chris Green, the History Chap, telling forgotten stories from British history. In 1853, Tsar Nicholas I of Russia made a series of miscalculations that would plunge Europe into its first major war in 40 years. He believed he understood how Britain and France would react to Russian expansion against the Ottoman Turks. He was catastrophically wrong. Nicholas assumed that Protestant Britain would never ally with Catholic France, that Austria would repay his loyalty, and that parliamentary democracy was too weak for decisive actions. The resulting Crimean War would cost nearly 500,000 casualties from all sides. This is the story of how the Tsar miscalculated and how the British ended up fighting Russia in the Crimean War. The roots of the Crimean War lay in what was called in the 19th century the Eastern Question, and that was all to do with who would or could take advantage of the decaying Ottoman Empire. The key conundrum to the Eastern Question was how to gain territorial or commercial advantage whilst denying it to your rivals, without ending up in a major military confrontation. And maybe some felt it might be better to support that crumbling Ottoman Empire for no other reason than to prevent your rivals gaining an advantage. And fundamentally, it was this Eastern Question that would bring Britain, along with France, the Ottomans and the Italian Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont, into conflict with Russia in the 1850s. From their high point in the mid-16th century, when Suleiman the Magnificent had conquered Hungary and laid siege to Vienna, the Ottoman Empire had been in decline. Whilst it still ruled large parts of Eastern Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, its boundaries, especially in what is now Russia and Ukraine, had been pushed back in a series of wars. In the 1770s, they'd lost control of the Crimean Peninsula, which had been annexed by the Russians 10 years later. The Black Sea, which had previously been a Turkish lake, was now increasingly under the control of the Russians. Tsar Nicholas I of Russia was a man on a mission. A deeply religious Orthodox Christian, he believed that he was on a divine mission as inheritor of the Byzantine Empire, which the Ottomans had eliminated in the mid-1400s when they'd conquered Constantinople. This autocratic ruler had successfully quashed a liberal revolt in Russian-occupied Poland in 1848, and had then supported the Austrian Emperor by supplying 300,000 troops to put down a similar rising in Hungary. He saw the crumbling Turkish Empire as an opportunity to increase Russian dominance in the region. Indeed, shortly after he had ascended the throne in 1825, he had fought successful wars of expansion against both the Persians and the Ottomans, and he certainly wasn't adverse to doing so again. Referring to the Ottoman Empire, he famously told the British ambassador, Sir Hamilton Seymour, "We have on our hands a sick man, a very sick man." His solution was to put that sick man out of his misery by dismembering his lands with other powers. Whilst he suggested to the British that they should take Egypt and Crete, he would take the Balkans and, most importantly, Constantinople. By taking control of that ancient city, he would be fulfilling that dream as successor of the Byzantines. But there were much more practical 19th century reasons for his plans too. Control of Constantinople would give Russia a year-round ice-free port, which they lacked in the Baltic and the far north. Control of the narrow Bosphorus and Dardanelles would also allow their Black Sea fleet to sail unchallenged into the Mediterranean. And it was that possibility that set alarm bells ringing in other European capitals. The French had always vied with the Royal Navy for control of the Mediterranean, and had seen the eastern end of that ocean, especially Egypt and the Levant, as their sphere of interest. And whilst they had no love for the British, at least they'd learned to coexist since the Napoleonic Wars. A new interloper, however, could threaten that status quo. They were also concerned the Russian territorial ambitions might not end at Constantinople, as you will hear about in a little while. Meanwhile, the Greeks, whilst sharing Orthodox Christianity with Russia, were wary if the Russians were just up the Aegean Sea that they might start to become a rather overbearing big brother. And then the bells were also ringing in Turin, the the capital of the up-and-coming Italian kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont. They had an ambition to unite Italy into one country. One of the biggest obstacles to that dream were the Austrians, whose empire controlled the northeast region of what is now Italy, with the cities of Padua, Verona and Venice under Habsburg rule. With the seemingly close relationship between the autocratic and conservative Franz Joseph and Tsar Nicholas, witness the crushing of the Hungarian revolt, the last thing they wanted was a Russian navy operating in the Mediterranean and supporting the Austrians. Now, despite that cosy relationship between the Russians and the Austrians, alarm bells were also ringing in Vienna. Whilst their emperor, Franz Joseph, had happily accepted Russian troops arriving in his realm to crush the Hungarian rising, the Austrians had their own ambitions with regard to the crumbling Ottoman Empire. They cast their eyes on the rich pickings in Eastern Europe, and the last thing they wanted was that opportunity removed by an expanded Russia. And finally, alarm bells were ringing very loudly in London. Ever since the beginning of the 19th century, the British had been concerned about Russian ambitions to seize the jewel in Britain's imperial crown, India. As the Russians expanded into Central Asia and the Caucasus, defeating the Persians and local independent rulers, so those fears increased. They saw Russian control of Constantinople as yet another domino in this so-called Great Game. And rather like the French, they feared that the Russians wouldn't stop at Constantinople. Why not seize Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and the Ottoman province of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq? That would give them access to the Persian Gulf, dangerously close to British Bombay. Moreover, they could then sweep through Persia, bringing them to the borders of India itself. And furthermore, even though the Suez Canal had not yet been built, although the idea had been discussed, the short land route between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea in Egypt was already an important route to India. Passengers from Britain would travel through the Mediterranean, alight at port side, and then take a caravan on the 100-mile journey down to Suez. From there, they could board another ship to India. All in all, a far faster journey than travelling all the way round South Africa. A Russian naval presence in the Mediterranean would upset the balance of power, not least their own power, in that sea. And finally, whilst the British shared little in common with the Ottomans, they were their biggest trading partner, so Russian control could very well have a negative economic impact too. But the one place that these alarm bells were not being heard was in the court of Tsar Nicholas in St. Petersburg. The spark to the conflict that would become the Crimean War was lit in Jerusalem, and it all had to do with who had precedence in some highly sacred and symbolic Christian churches. Specifically, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, believed to be the site of Christ's burial and crucifixion, and the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, Christ's birthplace. At the time, Jerusalem and the other sites of the Holy Land were Ottoman territory. Despite being Muslims, the Ottomans allowed these churches to operate. The problem was that various Christian denominations shared these churches, and each vied for the premier role. Disputes frequently arose as to who would hold the keys to each church, and who would conduct services and when, and also which sect could place ornaments and decorations where. By the middle of the 19th century, these disputes were becoming more frequent and more violent. James Finn, the British consul in Jerusalem, reported witnessing regular fistfights between Catholic and Orthodox priests, where even candles and crucifixes from the altars were used as weapons. In 1851, the Ottomans had been forced to place Muslim police outside the churches to enforce some sort of discipline. And into this localised and to modernise slightly comical dispute strode two powerful leaders, each looking to use the situation to their own advantage. Ever since the Crusades, France had taken it upon itself to defend the interests of Roman Catholics in the region, and now the Emperor of the French, Napoleon III, waded in. The nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, he had become president in 1848 before staging a coup in 1851 and elevating himself to emperor. He saw the dispute over the holy sites in the context of his wider mission to restore the glory of France, which he believed had been marginalised by the other European powers since 1815, and chief amongst those powers was Russia. Tsar Nicholas not only had his eyes on Constantinople, but also believed that he was the rightful protector of his fellow 12 million Orthodox Christians inside the Ottoman Empire, a right he believed Russia had been given by treaty in the previous century. The Sultan in Constantinople disagreed with that interpretation, which would have effectively allowed a foreign power huge rights inside his own empire. In 1852, with regard to the holy sites, he found in favour of France. This might have been because he was choosing the lesser of two evils, or it might also have been due to the presence of a French warship in his waters. The Tsar demanded that he reverse that decision, and in May 1853 upped the ante by issuing an ultimatum that Russia be officially recognised as protector of all the Sultan's Christian Orthodox subjects. Not surprisingly, the Sultan rejected it. In July of that year, to further increase the pressure, the Russians moved troops into the principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, the latter forming a large part of modern-day Romania. Nominally, they were part of the Ottoman Empire, but with a huge degree of autonomy. Nicholas claimed his troops were there to protect local Christians and his fellow Slavs from the Muslim yoke. From Nicholas's autocratic, isolationist, militaristic point of view, it was a calculated decision which he believed would work. After all, he'd used this very approach, sending troops into the Danube basin, to squeeze concessions out of the Turks before. He also knew that with an army of 1 million, he had the men to win a war of attrition should the Turks resist. He also calculated that the other main military powers of Europe would not intervene. And why should they? It was not as if they shared any values with the autocratic Muslim Sultan and his feudal regime. And following the failure of various liberal revolutions across Europe in 1848, he believed that the forces of conservatism were in the ascendancy, especially in Prussia and Austria. Indeed, he believed the Austrians owed him one for helping them put down their rising in Hungary, and they would support him militarily should one of the other powers get involved. And in the Tsar's mind, that meant France and Great Britain. However, he concluded that in France, Napoleon was still trying to secure his hold on power and was in no position to enter a war. And anyway, look what happened when his uncle tried to take on Russia. And as for Britain, he dismissed the British constitutional monarchy with its Houses of Parliament as inherently weak. He saw its Whig Peelite government, led by Lord Aberdeen, as hopelessly divided between doves like the Prime Minister and hawks such as the Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston. Now, whilst the Royal Navy was numerically superior, it was spread all over the world, whereas his navy was concentrated in the Baltic and the Black Seas, where they could probably hold their own. And anyway, if the British wanted to prevent Russian expansion in the Balkans, they would need to fight a land war. And quite simply, they didn't have the numbers. Despite their reputation, the British army was tiny in comparison to his, only 140,000 men in total, of whom over half were stationed in far-flung outposts of the British Empire. And whilst they could defeat the Sikhs and the Chinese, they hadn't fought a European land war for 40 years. The only way they could even hope to play a role in a European land war was if they had some allies. And he was confident that Austria and Prussia would keep out, so that left Britain's only possible ally as France. France, England's historic enemy, now led by Napoleon's nephew. Roman Catholic France and Protestant Britain. It was never going to happen. Confident in his reasoning and refusing to listen to the few advisers who dared to share a contrary view, he decided to reissue his ultimatum to the Sultan. It would turn out to be a massive miscalculation. On the 5th of October 1853, the Turks declared war. They went on the offensive later that month, crossing the river Danube. They then opened up a second front in the Caucasus, in modern-day Georgia and Armenia. Despite this Turkish response, Nicholas was supremely confident. He had the men to absorb these offensives, and then his numbers would tell when he counterattacked. His confidence seemed well placed, as his armies in the Caucasus pushed the Turks back towards the strategic city of Kars. With the Ottoman army in danger of being trapped in Georgia, the Sultan ordered a fleet to sail from Constantinople with desperately needed supplies. However, it was now late November, and the fleet ran into a storm and was forced to take refuge at the port of Sinope. Whilst the Ottoman admiral was aware that the Russian fleet had set sail from their base at Sevastopol in the Crimea, he wasn't expecting what happened next. On the 30th of November 1853, the Russian fleet, consisting of 11 warships, including 6 ships of the line, sailed into the Turkish port. 3 of those ships of the line carried 120 guns apiece, whilst 3 more carried 84 guns. The Turkish fleet at anchor consisted of 12 ships, but none larger than a frigate, of which the best armed carried just over 60 guns. Even before the fighting started, it was a one-sided battle. But for the Ottomans, it was about to get even worse. When the Russians fired, they used new explosive shells, which punctured the wooden hulls of their opponents and exploded deep within. Of the 12 ships in the Ottoman fleet, only 1 managed to escape the carnage. The other 11 were either sunk or ran aground. Even as it became obvious that the battle was effectively over, the Russians continued to fire on the stricken vessels and then turned their guns on the town. Afterwards, the Russian admiral claimed that he'd only kept firing because the enemy refused to surrender, and that the damage to the town came from burning wreckage of the Turkish ships, most of which, he claimed, they had set fire to themselves. Whatever the truth, by the end of the fighting, 37 Russians were dead and 229 wounded. At least 3 of their ships of the line had been damaged. But on the other hand, Ottoman casualties were 2,700 sailors killed. The one Ottoman vessel that did manage to escape fled to Constantinople, arriving on the 2nd of December with the news of the devastating defeat. The Battle of Sinope is still one of the 20 days of military honour celebrated in Russia, but it was to prove a victory with a sting in its tail. The battle led to an outpouring of anti-Russian sentiment in both London and Paris. Some British newspapers described it as a massacre, neatly forgetting, of course, any similar one-sided colonial battles the British might have or indeed would fight in the future. Even Prince Albert described the Tsar as a tyrant and enemy of all liberty on the continent. Newspapers such as The Times and the Daily Post railed against the Russians. Public meetings were standing room only. Contrary to the Tsar's belief that Christians in Britain would support his stand against Muslim oppression, Protestants decided that actually they had very little in common with bearded Orthodox priests wafting incense and praying to icons. Incredibly, or so it seemed to the Tsar, they urged their government to support the Turks. In Parliament, speaker after speaker rose to attack Lord Aberdeen's seemingly weak policy that had given Tsar Nicholas the confidence to go to war in the first place. One of the fiercest anti-Russian critics was the former MP for Stafford, David Urquhart. He published an 8-point plan which almost became a blueprint for the strategy the British would eventually adopt during the Crimean War. These included point number 1, cut off trade to Russia so that the nobles would lose their profits and turn against the Tsarist government. In modern words, sanctions. And point 2, destroy naval depots at Kronstadt in the Baltic and Sevastopol in the Crimea. The plan also included more outlandish actions, such as encouraging uprisings in Poland and Finland, and even bombing St. Petersburg. The government of Lord Aberdeen could have ridden out that storm of protest, if it were not for the more serious strategic consequences of that Russian naval victory. A few weeks beforehand, both the French and Royal Navies had been sent to Constantinople in a show of support for the Ottomans. The Tsar saw it as simple posturing, and at that stage, it was. But the Russian victory at Sinope had changed everything. Their success gave the Russian fleet based at Sevastopol free rein in the Black Sea. The Ottoman army in Georgia could not be supplied. The Russians could sail to Constantinople whenever they chose. They could even sail unopposed through the Dardanelles into the Mediterranean. The British and French strategy of Turkey as a buffer against Russian expansion was crumbling down, and it looked like Tsar Nicholas's ambitions were about to be fulfilled. But the Tsar's fatal miscalculation, or miscalculations, about how the European powers would react was about to come home to roost. In France, Emperor Napoleon III was indeed looking to legitimise his Bonaparte regime. And rather than dealing with his internal critics head-on, he, like many leaders before and since, saw a war as a way to unify his country behind him. And a war against Russia almost seemed like a continuation of the work of his uncle. He also saw it as a way of breaking the Holy Alliance of Prussia, Austria and Russia that had kept France in check since 1815. Furthermore, he was also under pressure from Polish exiles in Paris to support a new uprising against Russian rule, either with direct French support or because the Russians' attention would be elsewhere. Meanwhile, Nicholas fundamentally misunderstood British strategic thinking. Whilst he still thought in terms of the 18th century balance of power, Britain had developed a new global perspective, where Russian expansion anywhere threatened British interests everywhere. He failed to grasp that whilst the British saw the Ottomans as the sick man of Europe, their attitude had shifted from dismembering it to instead preserving it as a buffer against Russian expansion. And then the unthinkable to Tsar Nicholas happened. Great Britain and France decided to act together. That age-old rivalry had been swept aside as the British allied with a nephew of Napoleon to save the Ottomans. In January 1854, their fleets entered the Black Sea, both as a further warning to the Russians and to escort Turkish supply ships. A month later, they sent a joint ultimatum to St. Petersburg, demanding Russian withdrawal from the occupied principalities. They gave the Tsar until March to comply. By now, Nicholas was between a rock and a hard place. Suffer the personal humiliation of withdrawing under foreign pressure, or call the Anglo-French bluff and possibly end up with a major war. His whole personality and belief in his own destiny, coupled with his belief that Russian arms and the sheer land size of his empire would win out, meant that he chose to ignore the ultimatum. On the 28th of March, 1854, both countries declared war on Russia. The Crimean War had begun. Tsar Nicholas had totally misjudged British and French resolve, just as he would misjudge his army and navy's ability to defeat his opponents. And then there was one last miscalculation that would screw his plans. He had always assumed that Franz Joseph of Austria would support him, in recognition for his own support, putting down the Hungarian Rising. But once more, he had not taken enough note of the changing times. The Habsburgs were keen to take advantage of the sick man of Europe by expanding their own empire into the Balkans, and the Russian presence in the Danube principalities put those plans in peril. Franz Joseph now sat on his hands, refusing to support Nicholas, or even guarantee Austria staying neutral. It was definitely not the result the Tsar had been banking on. In Britain, war fever grabbed the country as the government prepared to send an army of over 25,000 men to the Black Sea region, along with a similar-sized French army. And whilst numerically smaller than the Russians, the British were a volunteer professional army. Confidence in London was high that the British Lion would overcome the Russian Bear. The Crimean War would last nearly 2 years and prove a sobering lesson for all the participants, in particular the overconfident Russians and the upbeat British. Whilst, as the name implies, the war centred on the Crimean Peninsula, the Royal Navy would also go into action against the Russians in the Baltic and even in the Far East. It's estimated that nearly 500,000 men from all sides were killed or wounded. The British would lose over 20,000 men, nearly 80% of them from disease rather than enemy action. They would fight in the bloody battles of Alma, Inkerman and Balaclava, as well as the grinding siege of Sebastopol. The Light Brigade would charge down the Rhone Valley against entrenched Russian guns. William Howard Russell would become the world's first war correspondent, and his articles in the Times doubled its circulation. The Lady with the Lamp, Florence Nightingale, would transform the care of wounded soldiers. And in the bitterly cold Russian winter, the British adopted clothes that we still use today: raglan sleeves, cardigans, and balaclava helmets. It would also give fighting experience to some of the great British generals of the mid and late 19th century: Colin Campbell, Garnet Wolseley, Evelyn Wood, and Charles Gordon. And it would see the inauguration of the Victoria Cross, 111 of which would be awarded for acts of bravery in the Crimean War. And I'm going to cover many of those stories of the battles, the other theatres, Florence Nightingale, the VCs, and military innovations in forthcoming episodes. In the meantime, I'm Chris Green, the History Chap. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.